Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, May 24th, 2021, and today we're going to be taking a look at the 2024 Republican presidential nomination and looking at some new data from various pollsters that give us a better idea of what a race would look like with President Trump and without President Trump. So, on your screen, you're looking at the political betting market, the Predictit.org market, where people are allowed to bet on who they believe will become the next president, senator, representative, always, just spending money essentially on elections, and that's just what this website is built for. Every time there's a new election, there's always going to be brand new market setup, including for the Republican presidential nomination 3 years in advance. And people already have some very interesting takes. If you're looking at some of these numbers here, you'll see that some people are truly betting on Kristi Noem or Mike Pompeo or Tom Cotton to become the actual and eventual Republican nominee for president in 2024. Some of these are long shots, and some of these are just people spending money on candidates in the event that they do start to rise out of news speculation or other types of things, and then they'll cash out on that. Or some people truly believe that Larry Hogan or Mitt Romney or Tucker Carlson will become the nominee for president in 2024. And if you look at how it's changed over time, it has fluctuated quite a bit. Donald Trump hasn't always been the leader. In fact, Ron DeSantis overcame President Trump around nearly the entire month of April, leading into the early part of May. Then President Trump took it away, and Ron DeSantis really only drove up in terms of the numbers here because people thought President Trump wasn't going to run. But we don't know yet, and even if you look at the market here where it says Trump files before president before 2023, 39 cents on a yes share, which means that nearly 39% of people are saying that yes, he will file before 2023, which means that's in a year and a half from now before we reach 2023. So President Trump very well could file before then, and those people would be correct. But all in all, this betting market gives us an idea of what the media is talking about, where Republicans and independents and Democrats think the race will lie. And if you're looking at the candidate list here, there are so many people that might actually run for president. Now, no one has announced that they're running. It's way too early to announce that. I think the earliest time we've seen someone announce they are running for president was John Delaney in 2017. But it didn't happen on the Republican side. Even in the 2016 Republican primary, there weren't any candidates that early on. So we won't get any official announcements, and some people have said that they're waiting on President Trump to make a decision. So of those in the publicly expressed interest column, it is only President Trump. But under the potential candidates list, you have so many people. You have all the way from Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, down to Donald Trump Jr. You're looking at a number of top names, people that are recognizable, and people that could actually have a realistic shot at the presidency or at the presidential nomination. I'm not going to go too far and say that all of them have a realistic shot at the presidency because, to be completely honest, they don't. But if you're looking here, you'll see some top names: Ted Cruz, Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, Larry Hogan, people that you might see in your average, news cycle that could make a name for themselves or expand on the name that they already have and win this nomination. And amongst those who have declined to be candidates, we know that this list probably will decrease. People announce that they're not running for president and then 2 years later decide that they're doing so. Hillary Clinton said that she wasn't running for president back in 2013. Barack Obama said he wasn't running for president back in 2006. People change their minds, and we all know that politicians sometimes can be deceptive. It's something that they do to sort of push away opposition research on them. If Kristi Noem says, "I'm not running for president," then there's no urgency for the Democratic Party to get this entire file on her. But if she announces a year before the primary, they have less time to get that opposition research. It all makes sense to deny that you're running until you actually make that announcement. Because at the end of the day, politicians do it all the time, and no one is really going to be mad. You can sort of just pivot it and say, because of Joe Biden's poor administration, I've decided now that I'm running, because it wasn't as bad 2 years ago. Essentially, you can make any type of excuse and the voters will eat it up, because that's how American politics works. So, looking at this entire potential candidate list, we actually have some preliminary primary polling data. This is all primary polling data that actually has started before the election. And if you're wondering why Donald Trump just started to pick up right around the beginning or near the beginning of 2021, is because he actually wasn't on the initial polls. People weren't expecting a president who would lose in 2020 to announce that they are running for president 4 years later. But we all know now, after the claims of widespread fraud, that President Trump isn't done giving up the 2020 election and will likely carry that until 2024. I don't know if you guys remember, but President Trump did make that promise that if Joe Biden was to win the election, that you would never see him ever again. Well, we know now that is completely not true. Just looking at the primary polling data, you can just see how large his presence actually is. And this recent data has all been taken in the month of May. And that's why I want to discuss it. They've asked two questions here, one without President Trump and one with President Trump on Echelon Insights and McClellan and Associates. Morning Consult / Politico only did one including President Trump. But they still hold some pretty interesting results. Let's take a look at just these three just for right now. So the first one we're going to look at is the Morning Consult poll from Politico. Essentially, they work together to get this data. They have a margin error of 2 with 782 Republican registered voters. How did they respond? Well, President Trump is on this ballot. And as you can see, the vote is actually pretty split. Even though President Trump is taking away a large plurality, there still seems to be a significant portion distributed amongst other candidates, which sort of tells us that even though President Trump may have an 80 to 85% approval rating amongst Republicans, sometimes a little bit higher, that doesn't necessarily translate to 80 to 85% of support. According to this poll, he has 48% support amongst respondents, and I'll talk to you about why that is a very good number. He only really needs to be at this PMG Management Corporation poll down in April 3rd, 2021. You'll see I'm circling my mouse around here, 44%. That's actually a good point for him to be in, but 48% is even better, and these two polls otherwise are also showing us some other data. But essentially, looking at the 48% number, not a bad one at all. But you do have to point out that still Mitt Romney is getting 4% of the Republican vote. Mike Pence is getting 13%. Ron DeSantis is getting 8%. Ted Cruz and Nikki Haley are getting 4% as well. Donald Trump Jr. is getting 7% and 8% are saying other, and then a few are distributed amongst 1% to 2% for their candidates. But just looking at those numbers, I'm honestly surprised. The fact that Donald Trump Jr. is getting prominence over Donald Trump himself among some Republicans is quite interesting. In addition, that 13% for Mike Pence is likely voters that don't agree with President Trump anymore, that want a candidate from the Trump administration, but not necessarily President Trump. So that's where I'm thinking that 13% is coming from. Nikki Haley and Ted Cruz, sort of the same idea as Mike Pence, but I also find it interesting that they are polling just as well or just as poor as Mitt Romney, someone who is practically exiled from the Trump wing of the Republican Party. Just quite interesting. And Ron DeSantis at 8% shows that he still has some support, but when President Trump isn't on the ballot, that's when his support actually rises. And that brings me to the next poll from McClellan and Associates. If you're looking at the data here, President Trump does well. Better than the Morning Consult poll at 57%, an outright majority. We'll talk about that 48% number after we get through this data, because at the end of the day, all President Trump needs is a wide spread of candidates and a plurality because of the way the Republican primary is set up. But this data is telling us that he probably is going to do well and possibly is going to win a majority outright. 57%, and then the next place is Mike Pence at 10%, and then Ron DeSantis at 8%. This is the second time we've seen him at 8%, and I find it to be interesting because it's probably because of the amount of support that he has received due to the media attention from CPAC and the statements that he's made and his handling on the Florida coronavirus situation. I think that's where he's getting that 8% from. It means that 8% of these Republican Party voters are saying, I prefer Ron DeSantis over President Trump. But take President Trump off the ballot. What does this secondary question tell us? Well, Mike Pence is the next top of the line. He's at 19%. Ron DeSantis is right up there at 18%. So they're pretty much tied here. But these are the only two candidates, and then Ted Cruz, that get double digits. The rest still remain around 1-2%. It really doesn't shift the amount of support Marco Rubio gets. He goes from 0% to 1%. Or Mike Pompeo from 1 to 2%. Or Tim Scott from 1 to 2. Or Mitt Romney from 2 to 3. The only significant uptick is Ted Cruz from 3 to 12. And Ron DeSantis is a significant uptick from 8 to 18. But as we've seen in other data, this is something we expected. Ted Cruz actually hasn't always been polling as well, even when President Trump isn't on the ballot. But main takeaway here, when Trump isn't there, it's a race between Mike Pence and Ron DeSantis. Ted Cruz could come in third place. And that's something we've seen pretty consistently when Donald Trump is not on the ballot. But when he is, he seems to be either getting a very large portion of the plurality, 48% is 2% off from 50, or the outright majority. And the final one we're going to look at is Echelon Insights, which shows Donald Trump at 63% and 31% of voters saying other. Now, 31% is much higher than what it was in 2020 because there actually were some people who ran against President Trump, but still not enough to defeat him. If you're already at 63%, there's no chance that you lose whatsoever. When you take him off the ballot, however, this is the poll that shows Ron DeSantis ahead. Mike Pence at 14%, then Ted Cruz at 9%, then the rest are 5 or below. Actually, Donald Trump Jr. is at 6%. So those 4, then the rest are 5 or below. But Ron DeSantis takes the lead. 22-14 is a pretty good one. I mean, that's not necessarily the best. You need way more than 22% in order to win the actual primary. But if you start out with this advantage and Donald Trump announces that he's not going to run, Ron DeSantis actually could become the Republican nominee in 2024 and potentially the next president of the United States. Now, I mentioned this 48% number because I want to point out how the Republican primary process actually is a little bit, I wouldn't call it rigged because that has a very negative connotation to it, but it does skew heavily in favor of the person who wins by a plurality. The way the Democratic nomination process works is almost every single state is decided through a primary and decided through a proportional one at that. The Democratic Party doesn't have any winner-take-all states. The Republican Party, however, does. A perfect example is South Carolina, where it doesn't necessarily represent the will of the voters. Donald Trump won less than 1/3 of the vote in South Carolina in 2016, yet won 100% of the delegates. Hillary Clinton, on the other hand, won 74% of the vote and did not win 100% of the delegates. She won 39-14, yes, an advantage, larger than the percentage that she won by, but still proportional. Bernie Sanders still got some of those votes, even though he won just 1 in 4 voters in the state. Donald Trump didn't even get 1 in 3 voters in South Carolina, yet won 100% of the delegates. Only got 10% more than Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, and yet the delegates weren't equally distributed. And in some of these states, they have a system called winner take most, where someone who wins, even by a plurality, will get most of the delegates. That's just how the primary process works. Of course, in some states, Donald Trump won by a very large amount, but that really shows you, I think, how some of these states, even with narrow advantages, can really drive you to victory, can really give you that victory that you were not necessarily expecting or you wouldn't have had you been running on the Democratic side. Because that's what really could drive Ron DeSantis or even Donald Trump to victory. Because if his popularity rating does decrease, if Donald Trump does fall out of favor, as maybe the Morning Consult poll suggests, where he dips below 50%, it still doesn't matter. As long as he's getting that plurality, he's going to win the nomination. He's going to be able to win, especially if other candidates are here. And looking at some of the results, let's see if we can find some of them here, you might also see that, again, you are seeing a very lopsided result. Donald Trump received 43% of the vote in Alabama and won 36 delegates. Ted Cruz won 21%, roughly half what Donald Trump won, and only won 13 delegates, less than half of 36. If you're looking at some of these other states, I find it to be interesting just to see the results. You're looking at a number of them where candidates didn't necessarily perform as well as they should have, but still could have earned delegates had this been a process ran by the Democratic Party. But that simply was not the case. Just looking at a lot of these numbers, looking at the amount of delegates won in certain states, despite the vote not necessarily totaling up to that, it is interesting. And if you look at the entirety of the results, if you're looking at the distribution in terms of percentage of the popular vote won versus the amount of delegates that they actually won, you'll see a very unequal distribution. Donald Trump won 44.9% of the popular vote and won 1,441 delegates. Ted Cruz got more than half of the popular vote, but didn't even come close to half of the delegate count. Marco Rubio got 1/4 of the popular vote that Donald Trump did, and only got 173 delegates to Donald Trump's 1,441. John Kasich is in a very similar scenario. I just think it's quite interesting to see how the primary process skews heavily in favor of the person who wins by a plurality, not necessarily by a majority or, the Democratic process, which is entirely proportional. The Republican primary process does have proportional states. They're not all that way, but generally speaking, they do have proportional states, but it really doesn't matter because the winner-take-most system does skew heavily in favor of the person who does win the state. And I know that seems fair, but when you're winning 32-5, 32.5 to 22, and you're winning 100% of the delegates, that's when it starts to get tricky. And that's when you start to question whether or not it's actually something that's supposed to be truly representative of the Republican primary vote or representative of that subsection of the party that continuously votes for one candidate just by a simple plurality. And I also do want to highlight that Donald Trump won that nomination without the majority of the popular vote. So if he was able to win way more delegates than anyone else with just 44.9% of support, can you imagine what he could do with 63%? Can you imagine what he could do with 57%? Can you imagine what he could do with 48%? He's not going to face strong primary opposition. Even though he's not at 90%, 48 is more than enough. 44 was enough in 2016. As we now know, looking at those numbers, more than enough. President Trump can win the nomination. He doesn't need overwhelming support to do it because of the way the primary process is set up. And I can tell you now, based off the numbers that Donald Trump Jr. is receiving, based off the numbers Mike Pence is receiving, Nikki Haley, Ted Cruz, once those candidates sort of peel themselves away from the race because President Trump, in an eventual case where he does announce, he will receive an uptick in support, which just means that he is absolutely the front runner for 2024. But when you take him away, it's a race between Ted Cruz, Ron DeSantis, and Mike Pence, really between Ron DeSantis and Mike Pence. But we will see a pretty competitive election cycle if Donald Trump doesn't decide to run. But if he does, then it's an entirely different story. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.